Normally, on Ascension Sunday, you would think about the fact that Jesus rose and what that means. And so today I want to do that by continuing the story that we've been looking at in Acts as Paul and Barnabas have gone on this first missionary journey, and to see how they are living in the light of Jesus being ascended. I think it's about making disciples, because that's what Jesus had told them to do, was to go into the world and make disciples. So the first question then is, well, what is a disciple? And traditionally we've understood that a disciple is the pupil of a teacher, somebody who learns from another person. It's a word that doesn't appear in the Old Testament. And yet in the Old Testament, there are clear examples of people who were disciples. Just a couple of the most obvious ones: Moses and Joshua. Moses, the leader of this people, and Joshua, who spent time with him, learning from him, being with him, seeing how he dealt with circumstances and situations, on occasion being allowed into the tabernacle, into the presence of God, instead of Moses. It's a clear discipleship relationship, one training the other to take over responsibility and to follow on in leadership of the children of Israel. And that's what happened. What about Elijah and Elisha? Here's this prophet of God who does amazing things. And then Elisha comes and says, let me go with you, let me learn from you. And that's what happens. They spend time together and one learns from the other. When you get through into the New Testament, the word disciple actually is only found in the Gospels and in Acts. In other places, they use different words: friends, brothers, servants of God, that kind of thing. But disciples in the Gospels and Acts. And by this point, what has happened is that we understand the Pharisees have disciples. There are schools of Pharisees, and the main Pharisee will do all the teaching, and he'll have a whole load of students who learn from him. And that's a concept that we're kind of familiar with. We know that John the Baptist had disciples, because they came to speak to Jesus and ask Jesus the question John asked, are you really the one? They also helped him when he was in jail, and they buried him when obviously he was dead. But then Jesus has disciples. Jesus chooses these 12 to spend most time with. But there are others who are there and they're learning from Jesus and spending time with him as well. But by this point, Jesus does something different, because what he says to these people is, if you want to be my disciple, it's not just about spending time with me. It's not just about listening to what I say. It's about doing what I do and being willing to give up everything, if that's what's called for, to follow me. And that's taking it to a whole new level. Jesus actually says, you need to do what I'm telling you, and there's a cost involved in that. So let's see what this story tells us about making disciples, and there are 4 areas that I want to think about. First of all, that it should be a priority, that there's a pattern in it, that there's a pause in it, and that there's a price to it. So priority. Well, we've already said Matthew 28, verse 18, Jesus says, go and make disciples of all nations, baptizing them and teaching them. So that's how you do it. He says, baptize them and teach them. How you make disciples. But go into all nations. Go into the world and make disciples. And so that's what they do. I mean, when you read the rest of the book of Acts, That's what they're doing constantly. From Pentecost, 3,000 people coming to faith on the day of Pentecost. And after that, the church just grows exponentially. Why? Because they're out there preaching and teaching about Jesus, telling people, baptizing them, and teaching them what they need to know. And so it's a priority for these first Christians. It's a priority for Barnabas and Paul. Everywhere they've been on this journey, what has happened is they've gone to the synagogue and they've begun to teach. And then when the synagogue throws them out, they began to teach anybody who would listen, because it's their priority. That's what they're all about. Paul, in 1 Corinthians chapter 9, verses 16 and 17 says, I cannot help but preach. And woe betide me if I don't preach, because it's what God has called me to do. Paul had been stoned. They had been chased out of village after village because they were preaching and teaching and making disciples. But it didn't stop them. Last week, we saw that Paul had been stoned, taken outside the city, and left for dead. The disciples there gathered around them, and he got up and went back into the city. It didn't stop him. So the question is, what is it that stops us? Do we really have making disciples as a priority in what we do, in what we believe, and how we live? And if not, why not? What is it that stops us? Why are we so reluctant to speak about Jesus? And I include myself in that. We miss opportunity after opportunity just to say a word. Sometimes, we might argue that, well, look at the society we live in. The society that we live in doesn't allow us to speak about Jesus. It causes all sorts of hassle when we want to do that. It's quite anti-Christian, and that's true. But, every society in New Testament times was anti-Christian. It's not any different. But they made it a priority to speak about Jesus and to tell what he had done. And then there's a pattern to what they do. And it starts with making converts. If you look at through the story of their journey from chapter 13, verse 12, it starts with the governor of Cyprus. It says he gave himself to the Lord. In chapter 13, verse 43, we're told that many Jews and lots of Gentiles came to the Lord. Chapter 14, verse 1, many Jews and Gentiles came to the Lord. Chapter 14, verse 20, it talks about the Lord's followers in Lystra. Now, that was a place where there hadn't been any followers, so obviously while Paul and Barnabas were there preaching, some of them had come to faith and began to follow Jesus. Chapter 14, verse 21 says, a large number, or another translation says, a strong core of Jews and Gentiles followed the Lord. It starts with people coming to faith in Jesus. It starts with conversion. And that's a word that, we don't use terribly much nowadays. It's not very popular. It's not very politically correct. We're not supposed to go and the other word for it is proselytize. We're not supposed to go out deliberately to make people Christian. But actually, that's exactly what we're meant to do. It's exactly what we're meant to do. We're meant to go and tell people about Jesus, about what he's done, about who he is, and ask them to follow him. When we think about the way it's described in the New Testament, it gives an understanding, I think, of the significance of what that is about. It talks about moving from sickness to health, darkness to light, death to life. It's from negative to positive. Why would we not want to give people good news? Why would we not want to be positive? Why would we not want to say, this is a really good thing? Believing in Jesus and following him and trusting him and giving your life to him, that's a positive. It's a good thing. And we would encourage you to consider it. See, conversion actually is not just about making a decision. It's not just about a one-off event, about deciding to believe. It's actually about lifestyle. It's about saying, I used to live like this, and now I want to live like this. There should be a discernible and distinctive change in belief and behavior when somebody comes to faith in Christ. Over the past 20 years, there's been lots of talk about church growth and about how you grow a church, and you study it at university and all of that kind of stuff. But actually, the reality is that most church growth in the West comes from people leaving one place and going to another. It's not new people coming to faith and giving themselves to God. It's about Christians moving from one place to another because they have better music, or they've got coffee, or they've got, there's all sorts of reasons why people do that. But I remember actually when we were in Newton Mearns in the church there was a new church being started in Glasgow. And folk came to poach. They came looking, they had gone round lots of churches around Glasgow to see who was there, who the leaders were, what they were doing, what they were involved in, and then went to those leaders and said, we would like you to come to us. Not particularly helpful, and not a really good way to grow a church. But it happens. Actually, what we should be concerned with is seeing new people coming to faith. In Acts chapter 2 through to chapter 4, it tells us regularly that the disciples met together, they worshipped together, they prayed together, they were together, and numbers were added daily. That's the kind of growth that we should be looking for, that we should be praying for. But it doesn't just happen. It actually means that you and I have to speak to our family, to our friends, to our neighbours, to our colleagues. We actually have to take a chance and speak to them about God. Because how else are they going to hear? How else are they going to know? And so then Paul and Barnabas, having started with making converts, they took these converts and they encouraged and strengthened them to remain true to the faith. Well, you see, lots of folk might have an issue with this, because what did they know? What had they been taught in the short time that Paul and Barnabas were there? What kind of faith did they have? Did they have it all worked out? Had they read Wayne Grudem's systematic theology? I mean, did they really understand everything that they needed to know to be a real disciple? Well, no, they didn't. But they knew enough. They knew enough to follow. They knew who Jesus was, and they knew that he was worth following, and that was what mattered. I suppose the question then is, what do you have to teach people? And there are some things that are kind of fundamental. People are sinful. But God is willing to forgive sin. And he did that by sending Jesus to die on the cross. That's how sin is forgiven. If we believe that, then we can be forgiven. And then we look to God to strengthen us and help us as we seek to live for him. We don't need to know how a church works. We don't need to know why some have bishops and some don't. We don't need to get into all of that. It's interesting, though, that the only thing of all they said to encourage and strengthen the disciples, the only thing that is recorded is, you're going to suffer. What an encouragement, isn't it? You know? Yes, come to Jesus and suffer. Of course, there's other things. Of course, there's other things. So why is this important? Why is this the only bit of the encouragement that's been written down for us who need to know all these years later? Well, it's because when you come to Jesus, there are going to be times of difficulty in your life. It doesn't all become wonderful. It would be absolutely, utterly wrong to suggest that it might. And so when the hard thing comes, you need to know that it's expected. You need to know that it happens to every one of God's children. And you need to know that he's there with you in it. That's why it's recorded. That's why it's the only bit that's left. Because it is an encouragement to know that even in the hard time, God is with you. And then they set an example. In John chapter 13, verse 15, Jesus says this, I have set you an example that you should do as I have done for you. Jesus sets an example. And then in 1 Corinthians chapter 11, verse 1, Paul says, follow my example as I follow the example of Christ. Not many of us would be bold enough or brash enough, I think, to say, follow my example. That's what Paul did. But when you've kind of got Paul's experience and you've lived like Paul, then maybe following his example is valid. And maybe that's why we're a bit reluctant sometimes to tell other people that we are believers and that we follow Jesus. Because maybe the reality is we're not setting a particularly good example. You see, people are watching you. If you tell people that you're a believer, they're watching you. Because they want to know, does what you believe make a difference to the way you live? Because if it doesn't, what's the point? Well, there is none if it doesn't make a difference to how we live. Paul and Barnabas, they've been good examples. They've preached, they've taught, they've suffered for it. They've shown the power of God through miracles. They have given an example of what it means to live as a Christian. I would encourage you to find someone who's maybe been a Christian a bit longer than you and to spend time with them asking, what can you teach me? What can I learn from you? And also maybe find somebody that's been a Christian for a little less time and share your experience with them. And then they appointed elders and leaders. Well, this whole journey took between 2 and 3 years, including the traveling time. 2 and 3 years. How much did these elders know? I mean, when you think about most Church of Scotland congregations, to be an elder, you've got to be at least middle-aged. Well, no, but there are always one or two exceptions. But that's the reality. I mean, if you look around, not just the Church of Scotland, the church in Scotland, and quite often in other places, that's the reality. We want people who are mature, but we do that chronologically sometimes, rather than by spiritual maturity. It's an age maturity. But here they didn't have that option, because these were brand new baby Christians. And so what did they do? Well, it says they chose them through prayer and fasting. There was a spiritual dimension to the ones who were chosen. Paul and Barnabas spent time praying about it and then chose them. And then here's the bit that lots of folk nowadays would struggle with. They said, you're on your own now. We're off. They left them, it says, committing them to God. Now, can you just imagine Billy Graham, when Billy Graham does a campaign, the first thing they want to know is who's going to do the follow-up? Who's going to, once these people come to faith, who's going to do the next bit? Who's going to do the follow-up? Follow-up? Yeah, I might write you a letter in 4 months or 10 years, whatever. Do you know, follow-up, there's no follow-up here. They're committed to God. They've chosen leaders that God has told them to appoint, and they're saying, God, you just deal with them, you lead them, guide them, you give them what they need, you be to them what they need. Of course, our circumstance is different because we've had generation after generation of church, and church has affected the whole of society. And we do need to ask the question, who's going to do the follow-up? We do need to do that because that is important. It's a different context in that sense. But, you know, if you're in a mission agency and you want to go and you go to another country, you want to go and you want to bring people to faith, but you would never think of just leaving them. You want to go and you want to bring them to faith and you want to encourage them and you want to develop them and you want eventually to let them lead their own congregations. But you know, one of the problems has been over the years that that's never happened. Or it has taken such a long time because you end up with a dependence. Folk thinking you're not ready. And them thinking, well, you know, we're depending on you to show us. Paul and Barnabas went, did what they had to do, got out and left them to get on with it. And then there's a pause. They go back home. They went back to Antioch in Syria, the place from where they had been sent originally, and they reported on the work they had done and that God was working not just amongst the Jews but also amongst the Gentiles. They reported that they had started these churches and that they were growing, that lots of people had come to faith in the Lord. And it says they stayed there a long time. It gave them a chance to rest and to recuperate. For slightly less than 3 years, they had been really busy. It had been really intense. It had been really difficult. They'd seen lots of blessing and fruit, and they needed to rest. And sometimes, you know, we go through periods in congregations where it's really busy, where there are just lots and lots and lots of things happening. And we also have to know that it's okay sometimes just to rest, to pause and reflect on what we've done and how it's going. And lastly, there's a price. Paul and Barnabas, they had to leave their home, their family, their friends, and go on this journey. It was a dangerous journey. On the way, they suffered sickness. They suffered persecution. It was hard. What price will we pay to make disciples? For some of us, it might be that we're called to leave home and family and friends. For some of us, it might be that we have to give up our job. For some of us, it might be the price is actually to stay where we are, doing what we're doing. But there's always a cost in serving God. And so what about today? Say in less than 3 years, Paul and Barnabas, they've gone, they've established churches and they've left them, and the church in that area is growing. In our society in Scotland and the West, we've had church for a long time. And we've kind of grown up with the idea that church is important and influential, and actually over time it has become less and less so. We're not in the same setup that they were, where there was nothing to start with. We've got something to start from, a basis to start from. But we know that church is in decline. So what has happened over the years is that there's been a whole raft of new ways, new initiatives to do church, fresh expressions. How do we do it differently? Or Church of Scotland produced the Church Without Walls report. There's been a whole raft of different things. There's also been new terms that get coined. Pre-evangelism. Because actually, the truth of the matter is, for many people in Scotland, the jump from don't know anything, never heard Jesus' name other than somebody saying it as a swear word, never been to church, don't know any stories, don't know anything about anything, to what most of us do on a Sunday morning. The gap is so big. So we do something in the middle, pre-evangelism, to draw people, to build relationships, and so on. But whatever we want to call it, whatever it looks like, I want to suggest that it's still about making disciples. That has never changed, and it will never change. And making disciples should be our priority. We should do it with an established pattern. We should know what we're doing and why we're doing it, not just make it up as we go and leave it to chance. We should take time to pause for rest and for reflection, and we should do it regardless of the cost. I was at an Alpha leaders meeting during the week, and they were saying there that Alpha organises these meetings, and they're asked more often than not about what happens before it and what happens after an Alpha course, and nobody really cares what happens during it, because most of the people who are there have done it before. And really, the questions are before and after. And what they're finding is that people are doing things. Parenting courses, marriage courses, they're having coffee mornings, they're doing all sorts of things to try and build up relationships with people before inviting them to an Alpha course. Because if they just invite people, they're not coming. There's no relationship, there's nothing to work with. And so, before actually taking steps to say to people, here's Jesus, let me introduce you to him, what they're finding is they have to do work beforehand. And so maybe that's something that we need to consider and we need to think about. But we do need to be aware that we're doing God's work. He's told us to go and make disciples. He's told us to go and make disciples. Most of us will have a family member. We'll have friends, we'll have colleagues, we'll have neighbours who don't know God. Maybe we're the only people who will ever have an opportunity to speak to them about God. Somebody during the week said that, they've just occasionally said to folk, I'm going to church, I'll say a wee prayer for you when I'm there. And then got a response recently, oh, is that you away? Will you say a prayer for me when you're there? Simple. It doesn't have to be long and complicated. It doesn't have to be deeply theological. It doesn't have to be any of that kind of stuff. It's simple. Keep it simple. Because the gospel is simple. Jesus loves me, this I know, because the Bible tells me so. It's not difficult. It's not hard. But it's really important. And so I want to encourage you as we work together to serve God in this place, to make disciples, to see lives transformed for him.